Welcome. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. We are thrilled to have about 500 people registered for today's event. The audio is available in French and English. Please use the interpretation button to select your language. I'm going to go over a few logistics now, and then we'll turn it over to Helen Young, who will introduce the series of webinars on the conceptual framework for addressing acute malnutrition in Africa's drylands. Then she will pass it to our moderator, Mary Allen. Mary will then lead the panel discussion. We will have at least 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. This webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours, and we will end on time. In case you are new to the Zoom platform, let me take a moment to orient you. On the bottom of the screen, you see the tools you need. Please use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen if you are having issues with the platform. Please use the Q&A to submit questions for the panelists or moderator. You can submit your questions at any time, and we will get to as many as we can. You can submit your question in English or French. Please bear in mind that audio quality may deteriorate unexpectedly and become insufficient for interpretation. Our interpreters will indicate this verbally and resume interpretation as soon as the sound quality permits. We hope that the end of the session won't be the end of the discussion with and among you. We have a few ways that you can continue to engage that I'll go over after we hear from the panelists. Now I'm going to turn it over to Helen to tell us more about the adapted framework and this technical series.
Thank you, Greg. In this series, we are reviewing and gathering feedback on a revised framework for addressing the drivers of acute malnutrition that is specific to Africa's drylands. I should say that when we talk about acute malnutrition, its predominant form is wasting. So you will hear us mention that term often. Last week, I explained that this impetus to review the drivers of acute malnutrition stems from the increasing recognition and acknowledgement among nutritionists and other professionals of the problem of persistent acute malnutrition, which has been found to occur in both emergency and protracted emergency contexts, as well as non-emergencies. An earlier study by Tufts University found that these emergency rates of acute malnutrition occur persistently across the Sahel and Horn of Africa. From the map on the right, you can see the areas where persistent acute malnutrition was recognized. They were frequently dryland regions, as shown by the map on the left, which stretch across the Sahel and include the Horn of Africa. I think there is wide agreement that the original malnutrition causality framework has served us very well, as it clearly describes the immediate and underlying drivers of acute malnutrition. However, this focus on the immediate and underlying causes contrasts with the lack of attention to the basic, more systemic drivers of acute malnutrition. And the fact that these basic drivers are often overlooked or misunderstood may partly account for the persistently high rates of malnutrition we see today. If we are to develop more effective approaches for reducing acute malnutrition or wasting, it is critical that we develop our understanding of these basic drivers and how they work. The revised framework conceptualizes these basic drivers as 3 interlinked areas, starting with environment and seasonality, then systems and institutions, and lastly, livelihood systems. Incorporated into this conceptual framework are the notions of resilience and vulnerability to a wide range of shocks, including climate, conflict, and other shocks, such as the current pandemic. Today, we are focused on systems and institutions. Last week, we discussed environment and seasonality and learned about the importance of understanding dryland variability, including seasonality, year-to-year variability, and the variability even over decades, including climate extremes such as drought and floods. If you missed this webinar, you can find the recording on the website. Next week, we will talk about livelihood systems vulnerability, resilience, and shocks. And during our final panel, Next Steps, How Drivers of Persistent Malnutrition Shape the Response, UN representatives from the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Food Programme, and UNICEF will present their perspectives on the 2020 Global Action Plan on Child Wasting. And they will also stress the urgency of developing radically improved approaches for addressing persistent acute malnutrition in Africa's drylands. Approaches that are going to be shaped by a new understanding of the basic, more systemic drivers of malnutrition. Throughout the series, our panelists will share recent research, and they will also raise issues and have reflections regarding methodology, strategies, and approaches for bringing about the systemic and institutional change that is needed. And after these 4 webinars, we will once again revise the conceptual framework for addressing acute malnutrition in Africa's drylands, based on the discussions, but also on your inputs and questions. So I would encourage you to engage. Next, we will convene a high-level roundtable meeting, as part of which the UN agencies will seek firm policy commitments to support a more systemic approach to addressing the basic drivers of acute malnutrition. And now I'm very pleased to turn it over to Mary Allen. Mary is an expert on resilience and livelihoods focused on West Africa. Mary will introduce the topic and the panelists and lead the discussion. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning and good afternoon. In today's webinar, we're looking at the role and influence of systems and institutions, both formal and informal, on livelihoods and on the underlying drivers of wasting. In the field of disaster risk reduction, it's well accepted that vulnerability is socially constructed and that political systems and institutions play a key role in both creating and preventing disasters, to the extent there's an ongoing campaign and hashtag no natural disasters. While malnutrition is a disaster for the children and family that it affects, I think of Bakary, who died a few weeks after I arrived in Mali in 1986, because his mother had had a second baby when he was only 11 months old. Or Musa, who 18 years on has grown into a tall, handsome young man who struggles with learning difficulties caused by the extreme malnutrition he suffered as a toddler after his mother died. We're looking at the role and influence of systems and institutions in order to better understand how they can potentially buffer shocks and sustainably address malnutrition. To help us to do that today, I'm joined by 4 speakers. Susanne Jaspars, Research Associate at the Food Studies Centre, School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. By Luka Kuol, Professor of Practice at the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies at the National Defence University. By Sunya Orre, Director of Technical Services, National Drought Management Authority in Kenya. And finally, by Nancy Aburto, Deputy Director, Food and Nutrition Division at the FAO. All of these panelists bring long and varied experience on systems and institutions. And we know that many of you online also bring extensive experience. So I encourage you to participate through the Q&A and in other ways on the series website that Greg will describe at the end. Let me introduce our panelists. Susanne, you're up first.
Thank you, Mary. Well, first of all, let me thank you or thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel, because drawing attention to the basic causes or structural causes of malnutrition has been something that I've been trying to do for a very long time myself. So what I will do in this brief presentation, can I have the next slide? Yes, is to really focus on 4 key messages or 4 key issues. One is how systems and institutions influence the distribution of resources and ultimately nutrition. Then how inequalities are magnified in times of crises. And then also why focusing on the immediate causes can actually become part of the problem. And then a few thoughts on the way forward. So when looking at the distribution of resources, I find it interesting to go back to the 1990 UNICEF framework. And because the discussion of the framework stresses explicitly how underlying causes are the result of the unequal distribution of resources in society. So then the document goes on to discuss a range of social, political, and economic factors that determine what is produced, how it is produced, and what is consumed. And actually the factors that are in that document, we can now kind of divide into various kind of systems and institutions. And I've done that on the slide, looking at social, political, and economic institutions. And you will see examples there, for example, social institutions such as labor relations, or informal institutions such as schools, actually not agricultural services, but social networks, CBOs, and political institutions such as the state structure, legal system, as well as kind of a number of economic institutions that are mentioned there. Now, when I talk about institutions, what I mean is the rules of society in terms of the distribution of resources, the interaction between people, and also the management of people's health and well-being. Now here, since we're concerned with persistent acute malnutrition, it's interesting to look at what happens in protracted crises. What happens in these kinds of crises is that it usually hits the poor or the politically marginalized the hardest. And these are essentially people who are either excluded or who do not have access to institutions, or who are not represented. And what that means is that they don't have the political clout to access or claim resources, whether it's land, food, jobs, or aid, or even justice. The other thing to realize is that institutions actually change in situations of crises. So for example, families are split or are displaced, disrupting social networks, and indirectly carrying practices and food insecurity. Also, institutions don't necessarily function in terms of providing services to citizens. And what you find in many countries experiencing protracted crisis is that political systems are actually dominated by systems of patronage, of kleptocracy, of kind of the use of violence just to ensure political survival. So my proposal here is that in an adapted framework, we keep political structures and systems at a slightly higher level from other systems and institutions because they have such a big influence on other institutions. Next slide, please. So looking briefly at the political economy of food in Somalia and Sudan. Now, in both Somalia and Sudan, it's generally always the same populations which suffer high levels of acute malnutrition. And this is going back many decades. And you'll see in these two maps, it's indicated by the roughly red and orange areas. So Sudan's kind of peripheries and southern and central areas in Somalia. Food crisis and famine also happens most often in these areas. Now, both countries are highly unequal. Power and resources are concentrated within a kind of central, more powerful elite, whether you're talking about land, trade, aid, finances, etc. And others, the people in the peripheries or in South and Central, are either unrepresented or excluded from national political and economic institutions. Each of these has also kind of experienced, and this goes back a long time. So this is the very historical kind of aspect of inequalities. Then finally, also important to consider here is the international dimension, or the influence of international politics and ideology. So for example, in things like sanctions, debt, and the way in which aid is provided, of course, determines whether institutions can function in relation to welfare or subsidies, and sometimes also who gets the aid and how malnutrition is addressed. In these two countries, we also need to think about Islamism. For example, in Sudan in the 1990s, The Islamist ideology meant denying famine and refusing Western food aid with obvious consequences. So all of this also needs to be part of an analysis of political systems. Now, more specifically about the political economy of food here, I mean, really what we're looking at is how political and economic processes and institutions related to food can create power for some and vulnerability in others. This can be done, for example, through the control of trade and the manipulation of markets, through land grabs or takeovers by the more powerful. And what's interesting and striking when you look at food aid is that food aid often feeds into those kind of existing kind of power dynamics. So you find that, for example, traders or even government can restrict food aid, which indirectly provides profits for grain traders because the prices go up. Diversion to soldiers or militia provides a resource for them or boosts local authorities. And then from a malnutrition point of view, very concerning is that the already marginalized are often also excluded from distribution. So there's plenty of examples in the past from these two countries about pastoralists or IDPs or particular ethnic groups and clans being excluded. So I think what we learn from that is that it's very important to look at power as well as vulnerability. Not only who sells the land, but who buys it, or who sells livestock or who buys it, who uses IDPs as cheap forms of labor, whether for agriculture or construction or whatever. So to recognize that some people will benefit from the failure of institutions whilst others are excluded, exploited, and therefore become malnourished. So in conclusion there, you can see that a crisis magnifies inequality. And I just want to talk very briefly also about how a focus or the current focus on treatment and behavior change in nutrition actually stops us from looking at these basic causes. Now, as many of you will know, from 2008, we've seen a greater focus on addressing immediate causes of malnutrition. It followed the Lancet, a series of Lancet articles, which suggested supplementation, feeding, and hygiene practices as kind of interventions that work in terms of addressing malnutrition. So as a consequence, many aid organizations spend a lot of time on social and behavior change communication to address malnutrition. And that can be anything from child feeding, household food choice, health-seeking behavior. And when I've talked to aid workers in Somalia and Sudan, you often see that reflected in what they say about why people are malnourished. And you can see the two quotes there. And you have to also realize that this is actually situations that are in the middle of a conflict situation. So it's quite odd to hear these things in that context. So how is it relevant to systems and institutions? Well, what this is doing is it's implicitly looking at what the malnourished are doing rather than how their access to and the functioning of institutions is affecting them as a group. Now, in addition to that, in countries like Sudan and Somalia, it's politically convenient not to analyze basic causes. I mean, it's very sensitive to start looking at kind of war strategies, unequal development, discrimination, or even how people benefit from the failure of institutions in analyzing the causes of malnutrition. But the danger is that you actually are not addressing the causes of malnutrition. And worse, you can actually feed into existing systems of discrimination and racism and therefore exclusion. And finally, what it does is it really removes or absolves governments from the need for protecting their citizens. So making sure, I guess, that their legal institutions are functioning. So ways forward. Well, I think the first thing is really to make basic causes visible, and it's really good that we started talking about it. Then, I think I've stressed the importance of looking at power as well as vulnerability. How do we do this? I think it's really important to start looking again, I would guess, at qualitative methodologies as well as quantitative approaches. And part of that can be community reflection and problem-solving approaches, whether it's, I mean, I always like to go back in time. So I think what is important is to kind of to look beyond the community or beyond what's happening in the community and look at reflections which can actually lead to more kind of revolutionary change. Yeah, and as part of that, maybe look at, which institutions beyond the community as well as within the community are important, how they function, who has access, who benefits from their non-functioning. And the last thing I want to say is that I don't think nutritionists should be doing this on their own. It's good to join forces with anthropologists, human rights activists, political scientists, and lawyers as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on now to Luka.
So, thank you very much, Susanne and Helen. First, I want to appreciate this timely engagement of this important framework that shape our work during the complex emergencies, and some of us we have been seeing through using it in terms of shaping the response. What I would like to do with this one is just only to locate the whole lot of issues of system and institutions in the region of the East Africa, because we have been doing some work on that one. And secondly, maybe to anchor the whole issue of system and institution to the issue of democracy, and then shed some light on some of these institutions, but importantly, the informal institutions, the implication of these to the addressing the malnutrition in the general in the dryland and in the Horn of Africa. I think East Africa, as Helen said, is a good classical example, the manifestations and microcosm of the drylands of Africa. And I think this map is showing how this region is being exposed to a lot of shocks, and whether it is population movement or whether it is environmental changes or even demographic changes. And we did some work with some of the colleagues on the rangelands of the East Africa, focusing about 3 or 4 countries, and we came out with this typology of how we can be looking at the dynamics of changing of livelihoods over time, and that you can clearly see the issue of access to good resource access, and then the issue of market access, and these are quite critical to see the dynamic changes. These are things related to the issue of the vulnerability and the malnutrition. What I would like to say here, so this is the region having a high level of malnutrition and food insecurity, but importantly, the final analysis is that it is a region that also infested with issue of decay of good governance and the governance deficit. But I guess the second slide, I think let us discuss. I want to renew the discussion around why democracy matters, and I think one of the things you could see clearly from that from the slide, there's a very clear case of retreat of democracy in Africa. But importantly, there's a very good example of this increased demand by the citizen for the democratic system and accountability. And I think the most important thing is that the fact that it is through drought and desertification is creeping, but the human complicity is the underlying cause of malnutrition and famine in Africa. And I want just to bring back the whole debate about democracy and famine, and especially for our analysis, it's very important to look toward sin, hits Europe in time and Syria, and the failure of public action as the main focus. And I think, as Susanne mentioned it very well in terms of the. So, for example, it's very important to see if you look at the emergence of famine, whether it is Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and northeastern Nigeria, the coming back of famine in 2007 is actually related to the democracy retreats. I think one of the journalists mentioned it very well, that as democracy retreats, famine makes a comeback, I think by David Killing. So then the second question is then why institutions matter? And I think I want to link it is very important in our analysis. In our analysis about is the institutions are actually manifestation of the democratic system and accountable. And I think it's very important to look at institutions as established social rules that structure social interactions. And I think there's a very good work by Hodgson and them. But let me highlight some of the few of these institutions briefly. Family institutions are quite important in determining kinship. Political and government institutions, these are provide the legitimate use of power. And economic institutions, as Susan mentioned, regulate the distribution of goods and services. And then education institutions, that is transmitting knowledge from one generation to another, and then religious institutions. And there's a very good work, I think, that was done by for Asia by Zhou and Van, which are actually helping very good to link the relationship between institutions and malnutrition and food insecurity. But then what is very important, the relationship between institutions and system of government and food security. A clear case, it has been established very well that the institutions, the countries that are democratic tend to have a very low level of food security, and the countries with undemocratic institutions or with undemocratic system, I mean, countries, they tend to have a very high level of food insecurity. And in the case of Asia, they found very clearly a high level of food insecurity tends to be in the, if certain conditions are, the government is elected, if the government is elected by the citizen and is accountable to the citizen, or if the government policy process is transparent, and even the government operations are efficient. So I think the whole argument is that because these are key elements, and this is that looking at the formal institution. But some of our work also, and in the case of many countries and in the drylands, the issue of the centralized federal system and parliamentary system tend to be actually equally important in terms of addressing delivering services, including and sustaining political stability. And this in relation to the centralized unitary and presidential system. Then the next slide, then why issue of traditional institution, I just want to highlight this point. I think there's an argument, especially in the dryland, the government itself is very far from the community, and you tend to see the traditional informal institution that set in order to fill this gap. And I think there's a lot of argument whether these informal institutions are accountable or undemocratic because they don't have electoral sanctioning system. But I think most of the case studies have shown that these informal institutions, they have their own inbuilt system and mechanism for accountability. It is exactly like using the case of South Sudan, where I use the issue of traditional code that are actually very transparent, and that shows the importance of this issue. Let us not underrate the mechanism inbuilt in these informal institutions. I think there's a very good work done about that one. In the African drylands, you can see, that's why I mentioned earlier, even my personal account of family in 1998, you have also the issue of how the system itself, they have a very powerful social safety net, and how these social safety nets are actually very important. For example, they have what is called famine code during the 1990s. But then when you have external agencies coming in, people tend to undermine the importance of these institutions. Maybe the last slide, what are the implications? What are the implications of the implication for addressing this acute malnutrition? Just about 4 points that I would like to highlight. And I think this has been echoed by many institutions. Invest, reform, and get institutional right, particularly economic and government institutions. And these are very important so that they can deliver better in ensuring sustaining access and utilization of food, because that's a very important to highlight. I think we need to move, like Susan said, to political economy, and then looking at the national level, the formal institution. But the most important thing, even though we are looking at the formal institutions, I think people need to invest more on checks and balances mechanism rather than just mere election. I think this has been shown by for this country to exit this fragility, I think the checks and balances are more important. And the third point, be mindful of traditional informal institutions, not only to ensure access to food, but also in the efficient utilization of food. And the last point, beside the institution, invest in system of government that is more accountable and responsive to the government at the local level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luka. I just wanted to remind all of you listening, if you have any questions for our panelist presenters today, please submit them using the Q&A function, which you'll find in the middle of your screen at the bottom. Okay, now let's hear from Orre.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, Jaspar and Luka. You have indeed, the earlier panelists have provided a broader perspective. I work with the National Drought Management Authority, which was established by the Kenya government through an act of parliament to address drought, food security in arid and semi-arid areas of Kenya, which is actually 80% of the Kenyan landmass, and whereas over 60% of all livestock are found. I will be narrower than earlier panelists because I will give the Kenyan perspective. Next slide. Yeah, the arid and semi-arid lands communities of Kenya face climatic shocks that lead to periodic losses and damages. For example, 2008 11 drought. The country, the cost of the drought to the economy was over 120 million US dollar, actually 900 million US dollars. And many of the pastoralists were forced out of their production system and became destitute in town. The production systems in these ASAL areas are basically pastoralism and climate and weather sensitive. The nutrition status of ASAL communities is directly related to livestock production performance. And as you know, livestock production is dependent on climate, on weather. Now, here, we are giving an example of Turkana County. The impact of droughts on nutrition of the children. And we can see the malnutrition rates. The blue bar at the top are the drought years. At the peak, we can see in February, and these are summaries, long-term averages. The highest that we ever had was 32% of children being malnourished, and this was a peak of a dry season. And we can also see the second bar, the graph, which was the least, the lowest figure that the Turkana County has ever experienced was 11% of children being malnourished. What this tells us is that at any one time, over 11% and on average 15% of children in good period are malnourished. And on average, during the drought periods, over 20, 22, 25% of the children are malnourished. The climate change has increased the intensity and the frequency of droughts in Kenya. And if no systems are put in place to address long-term systemic issues, then perhaps, and with the population growth, you might perhaps find these numbers going on. But of course, in Kenya, we have recently, we had devolved units, and with devolutions, there are quite of investments on resilience building measures. And perhaps with policy guideline, investment direction, we may reduce this gap and bring the children, malnourished children, perhaps below, at least below 15%. Yeah, so this basically shows the relationship, yeah, of droughts, multi-year droughts with child malnutrition. And the data we collect is actually, and we have a historical data going up to the year 2000. Now, I will look into, and this has well been articulated by the earlier panelists, the institutions of family, government, informal institutions, and in my case, I will actually focus on culture and norms, UN agencies, which actually complement governments in their efforts, the markets, and the economy. Now, in terms of the family is the basic decision-making unit. It's also the basic unit of production. Within the family, the norms define who performs what function, what role, and therefore, even in terms of burden on children, in terms of gender, is an issue that really influences nutrition and malnutrition. If we focus on the family, understand the norms, then we can get right in terms of nutrition. Because perhaps, and I think in one of the panelists I've seen that the assumptions that we make, but it is also important that at the family level, the nutrition education, although of course eventually the decision on how to spend on where is dependent on the family income. But it's important that at that level, families also understand those issues, and then they get facilitated. Government institutions actually play a key role because they provide the policy environment, the legal environment within which the family, the individuals, other actors, civil society organization can perform their functions in order to deliver on nutrition mandate. In the Kenyan context, in the past, the nutrition food security was actually mainly dependent on our partners' advice and also investments. We relied mainly in the past on World Food Program, FAO in terms of information, and other UN agencies. However, in 2008, after 2008-11 drought, the IGAD region, actually the heads of state from the IGAD region decided that they will end drought emergencies. And one of the issues that they have identified was that they should put in place institutions that will be held responsible for implementing government policy, provide information, guide governments and other actors on response and resilience measures. And Kenya government then established in 2011, actually National Drought Management Authority, which now bears the responsibility in terms of providing information at the right time, coordinating actors, and will be held responsible by government entities, by the media, and even by the communities if there are gaps in response, particularly in response measures. But of course, and we are also by law required to report annually to Parliament. I have earlier mentioned on informal institutions, the issues of culture and norms are very important because culture determines even what crops to produce, what foods to consume, who to consume what food, even within the household, who consumes, like if it is meat from a slaughtered animal, which part of the animal. And understanding of such norms is important. And where possible, where we perhaps need to influence, we influence. Where we need to leverage on, we leverage on. The UN agencies, and I am highlighting this, the UN agencies, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, these institutions actually complement government in their service provision, including providing necessary information, linkages, regional linkages. For example, we have the IGAD region, we have the East African community, and particularly when it comes to drought, it usually affects, for example, the entire Horn of Africa. And pastoralists move across. And that movement is also sometimes associated with conflicts. The UN agencies, the IGAD, the East African community provides a framework to allow us apply ecosystem-based approach in addressing drought-related movements and possible potential conflicts associated with such movements. My last one is on this one, on institutions, is markets and economy. It has been assumed, I've read in quite a number of literature that the northern people, the ASAL communities, the pastoral communities are far removed from the economies. They're not well linked to the economies, to the markets, and that they're not much, they do not much benefit from the market economy, or they're also insulated. But in many years that we operated in these areas, that has changed. That has significantly changed. These communities are linked to the markets.
Now, I'm sorry, we seem to have lost Orre's presentation. Okay. Just while we're trying to connect again, just to add, you can write questions in French as well as English. And please put them in the Q&A and not in the chat. Okay. I think we probably best move on to our final panelist now. Sorry about that. Move on to our final panelist, Nancy. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Mary, and my appreciation to all of the organizers and all of the panelists today for really developing and executing a great webinar, and also the entire webinar series, such an important topic around addressing acute malnutrition in the African lands. And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of you in attendance today. Next slide, please. Helen started us out in the webinar today with some information on food security and malnutrition in African drylands. And I'll take just a moment for us to consider some of the components of the global situation that are relevant for the way in which FAO is approaching the work that we can do in support of addressing acute malnutrition. So globally, as you know, we've all committed through the Sustainable Development Goals to reduce wasting. And wasting has currently affected roughly 50 million children, or more than 7% of all children under 5 at any given time. And despite decades of efforts and advancing knowledge and capacities, still only 1 in 3 of severely wasted children is receiving the treatment that they need. So there is no way that we can address the problem or the burden of wasting or acute malnutrition that in a way that we've already committed to doing without really a revolution in prevention. And to sustainably address the challenge of hunger, malnutrition, and particularly acute malnutrition, we have to achieve a combination of improving health services, strengthening social protection mechanisms, and sustainable and resilient food systems that can ensure access to healthy diets year-round. Next slide, please. But what is a healthy diet? A healthy diet is a diet that's sufficient in quantity and quality, meaning it meets all of the nutritional needs, not just calories, but it also means that it's safe and that it consists of a diversity of foods. And so how can we ensure this, especially for children and vulnerable women, year-round? Well, we know that diets are influenced by personal behavior, often called consumer behavior, but in the sense of being the consumer of the food, not a consumer that in the sense of purchasing, but in consumption of food. So this is all of us. There are decisions that we make about when, where, and what to eat, and caregivers make these decisions on behalf of young children. However, we can't merely tell people to eat better diets. We can't merely tell caregivers, give children better diets. This is something that Susanne touched on in her presentation. And from a food systems approach, the reason the reason that this is not adequate is because personal behavior choices are not made in a vacuum. They also depend on the food environment. That is what is available, what's economically accessible, as well as what is appealing. Nonetheless, we cannot merely tell vendors in the markets just to offer more foods that are needed for a diverse diet in their stalls. And this is because food environments are dependent on a larger food supply chain infrastructure, which includes production inputs, production, storage, distribution, processing and packaging, and marketing of foods. And this is going to look very different in different contexts. But nonetheless, this entire infrastructure is going to affect perishability of foods, and it's going to affect food safety. All of this is influenced by what we've been talking about today, the political, programmatic, and institutional actions and environments. So the entirety of what you see on this slide is what we mean by a food system. So the bottom line is, in order for us to ensure that we can address malnutrition sustainably, we can't merely provide food at a given time of crisis. We also need to ensure that there's coordinated efforts across the range of actors and institutions and sectors that can ensure that diverse foods are produced, that they're handled and processed appropriately, that they're distributed, marketed, and priced fairly, and then that they're purchased or they're procured, and they're prepared and they're cooked, and they're consumed adequate to the needs of all of the individuals in a household. You can think of this system like a balloon that's full of water. No matter where on that balloon you squeeze, the whole balloon is going to be reshaped by the water squishing around. And when we take a food system approach to thinking about how young children can be assured of diets that are safe and diverse and include sufficient quantity and quality, we recognize how actions across the system are interlinked, or how we are making that water move around that balloon. And in doing so, we can work towards actions that balance the water and keep that balloon from breaking to achieve sustainability across the system. Next slide, please. And for those of you that are familiar with this food system for nutrition diagram from the high-level panel of experts report, you'll know already that food systems are also influenced and influence a number of critical factors related to sustainable development, such as gender equity and equality, the environmental context, economic growth, demographics, including immigration, etc. All of this needs to be taken into account in a systems approach. But this also gives us an unparalleled opportunity to influence goals across the entirety of the SDGs. And it's also a great opportunity because food systems are the sources of livelihoods for billions of people across the globe. Over 1.5 billion people are directly employed in agriculture, and more than 4.5 billion people depend on the food system in some way for their jobs and livelihoods. That means that while they work to produce, collect, store, process, transport, and distribute food to consumers, they also depend on that work to guarantee their own access to healthy diets and food for themselves and their entire families, including young children. Thus, when we work in a food system approach, one thing that we always keep in mind is ensuring decent wages and protection of livelihoods across the entirety of the food system. And this is part of the process to strengthen food systems for ensuring healthy diets. So what does this look like, putting this theory into practice? I've got two examples that I'll quickly go through today. So in 2018 in Somalia, there was a 2-year-long drought that was followed by heavy rains, and that led to widespread flooding. In response to the large-scale food insecurity and the shock to livelihoods that this brought about, a number of partners launched what's referred to as the Somalia Emergency Drought Response and Recovery Project. It's a long name. And this had an aim of mitigating the risk of malnutrition. It's often referred to as a Cash Plus program. So Cash Plus in Somalia is the shorthand that's often used. And it was meant to tackle the challenge of food insecurity and malnutrition with complementary actions across the entirety of the food system for greater sustainability and impact. There was support provided in the form of agricultural inputs for farmers and support to pastoralists, and capacity strengthening in handling techniques to increase food safety standards and strengthen supply chains for diverse vegetables and for milk and dairy. This was combined with financial support to increase families' purchasing power for making more foods available to those families because they were made more affordable, and supporting infrastructure for storage to increase food stability, such as hermetically sealed bags and containers for milk products. Finally, there was a consumer awareness campaign and nutrition education efforts in communities and in households, emphasized both men and women for equal empowerment, which were complemented at the policy level with the development of a context-relevant nutrition and food safety education guideline document. Next slide, please. And a second example comes from South Sudan. Similar efforts have been underway in a number of areas in South Sudan where food insecurity and risk of malnutrition is prevalent, which unfortunately has been in a lot of the country since the increase in civil unrest started in 2016. To respond to this protracted crisis, FAO and a number of partners have implemented a nutrition-sensitive voucher program using a food systems approach. Food supply chains are strengthened through inputs and capacity for cultivating diverse crops that can be harvested year-round, and improved post-harvest handling, such as using solar dryers for vegetables in order to increase shelf life and food safety. Food environments have been strengthened through a market assessment to target outlets that can manage the provision of diverse foods as part of the voucher program, providing vendors with a stable market and with increased capacities to support their livelihoods. Consumer behavior has been supported through the provision of vouchers for fish, dairy, vegetables, and meat, a number of different foods needed for a healthy diet. And this is especially important through targeting households with children at high risk for malnutrition. The impact is short-term ability to access foods from the market, but also longer-term sustainability of healthy diets through strengthened supply and capacities across the entirety of the food system. So in summary, for FAO, our focus has been on building a strong foundation to pursue the vision of a world free from hunger and malnutrition, where food and agriculture contribute to improving living standards of all in an economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable manner. There's a critical need to shift our focus from a single component agri-food interventions towards this systems approach. It's the only way that we're going to shift the dial on malnutrition and eventually reach our ambitious targets for wasting reduction. Thank you very much for your attention, and back over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Nancy. I think we've got Orre back online. He lost his connection. So I'm just going to ask Orre to present his final slide. If we could go back to Orre's final slide.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you very much. I apologize. There was a network problem. I will second last slide and then last slide. I was left with 2 slides, if that will be okay. Yeah. Coordination and the resource mobilization mechanism at national and sub-national levels are some of the key institutional coordination mechanisms that we must have to address short-term and long-term challenges associated with child malnutrition. In the Kenyan case, we have the Kenya Food Security Meeting at the national level. We have Kenya County Steering Group and Intergovernmental Committee on Food, on Drought and Food Security. These institutions, this mechanism helps us in making decisions at the appropriate time and also making actually the appropriate decisions. We must also have, and here we're addressing the issues of systems, web-based drought response mechanism. Drought response requires that you respond appropriately and on time in order to save lives and livelihoods. We have, with the support of the European Union, managed to establish a web-based system where decisions are made actually within a day and the response triggered, requests made within a day, responded to within a day. And through the same mechanism, county governments, with the edified information that we provide, act within, being the first line of actors within appropriate time. And there are currently studies going on. Actually, there's a study now going on to compare our response mechanism for 2008 and 11 and the most recent drought. We must also have local, county, and national level drought contingency plans, helping communities, the local level institutions to develop drought contingency plans, building drought scenarios, and establishing their strengths, their capabilities, and what needs to be sourced externally, established well in advance, is a major component of planning for drought impacts. And I really appreciate the role of the health sector, particularly the nutrition sector, in that at the county level, at the very local level, they're very active. We have district integrated first classification, integrated information system, which helps us identify the hotspots and develop response mechanisms. We need also to have a robust drought early warning and information system. Without reliable information, without credible information, you might not respond at an appropriate time, or even if you respond, it might not be the appropriate response. We must also, as a country, we have a funding mechanism for drought, and not only drought, we are actually now establishing a mechanism for all the disasters, such that we have set aside resources that address long-term resilience, preparedness, and immediate response. And we have also apportioned those resources in such a way that you build systems in the long run, but we have set aside resources just for response. The strategies should be linked to national and county plans and budgets. We have programs and projects. We have cash transfer programs, scalable cash transfer programs, where at the moment, 4 of our most drought vulnerable, poorest counties have 100,000 poorest households on regular cash transfers. And during drought period, when the purchasing power of the households are affected, that then is scaled up and down because we have systems for response. We have opened bank accounts for these households. We have registered them. We have ranked them. So we have the Hunger Safety Net program, a cash transfer program. We have index-based livestock insurance, index-based crop insurance to help us on this. In terms of further information on some of the mechanisms that we have, you can visit our website, which is displayed. In terms of the information, I'm sure there are some of the panelists that are interested to know what are the nutrition status in our country. We produce monthly bulletins. We also we do IPC first classification biannually after we have by model rainfall, and all those reports and the other works that we do are found in our website, www.ndma.go.ke. Next. What are some of the sustainable solutions from our own experience? It's similar to actually what I have earlier presented. I'm not going to present much, but you must strengthen relevant institutions with a role on nutrition and food security outcomes at all levels, including local level. Provide mechanisms for accountability and reporting and information sharing. And this is very important. Without good accountability frameworks, you cannot lead, you cannot coordinate. Establish and institutionalize champions that will take responsibility for the delivery of the vision of the government. And in this case, for the Kenyan case, we have NDMA. When there's a challenge, then of course there's a problem. The government, the civil society organization, the communities have institutions to question. Establish and strengthen systems for data and information management. Data is key. With good data, good information, you can know where you are going, and what you need to do. Coordination and also resource mobilization internally and also externally. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Orre. This concludes the prepared topics we had for discussion today. Before we move on, I'd just like to take a few minutes to sum up some key messages from today's speakers. First, we heard from Susanne, who told us how systems and institutions influence the distribution of resources in society, and therefore nutrition. Inequalities are magnified in situations of crisis, and Susanne challenged us to think not just about vulnerability, but also about power. Who benefits from failed institutions? She warned us not to make the problem worse by only looking at what the malnourished are doing and at treatment. Blaming mothers doesn't link malnutrition to unequal development and to discrimination. She closed by proposing that we work with communities to examine the institutions both within and outside their community to identify pathways for revolutionary change. After Susanne, we heard from Luka, who reminded us that democracy matters because human complicity is the underlying cause of famine. And while government and economic institutions may have the most influence on food security, the contribution of traditional and informal institutions can be crucial. Luka asked us to invest in getting economic and government institutions right, and to invest more in mechanisms to ensure checks and balances. Third up was Orre, who showed us how the nutrition status of pastoral communities in Kenya is directly related to livestock production which is both seasonal and sensitive to climate shocks. Sunya asked that we build sustainable solutions to malnutrition by strengthening the existing systems and institutions that have a role to play in nutrition, such as the Kenya Drought Management System. Our final presenter was Nancy, who argued that to sustainably address the challenges of hunger and malnutrition, everyone must have access to a healthy diet all year round. To achieve this requires a combination of improved health services, strengthened social protection mechanisms, and sustainable and resilient food systems. With the remaining time, I'd like to open up things more generally to the audience. So I'm now going to hand over to Greg, who will manage the question and answer session. I know he's been busily collecting the questions that you've been sending through.
Thanks, Mary. Before we get to the Q&A, just a brief mention that you can follow the entire series on our website, which you should be able to see on your screen. So I really encourage you to stay engaged. You can see recordings and all the other links to the other webinars that are going to happen. So let me then move quickly to our questions and answers. Let me go first to, I've got a question for Susanne. Susanne, why is it so bad to focus on behavior? Can we not look at behavior as well as systems and institutions as causes of malnutrition?
Thank you, Greg. Nice question. Well, yes, I mean, when I kind of highlighted the issues of focusing on behavior, it was really kind of cautioning against just emphasizing that. And I realized that, for example, in nutritional surveys, it's you know, well, nutritional surveys are often dominated by kind of trying to quantitatively assess different kind of feeding behaviors, health seeking, hygiene. And so in that way, it's much easier to assess it and to focus on it. So, but it was really saying, you know, we shouldn't just do that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at behavior at all. And I think actually Nancy explained very well how behavior change or consumer behavior is linked to much kind of larger factors. I mean, the whole kind of the whole supply infrastructure, the political and economic factors that even influence those. So yeah, I was just cautioning against the dangers of not looking at these kind of wider systems and institutions, which I realize are much, much more difficult to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. Let me just go to a question I've got over here. It got tucked into a little bit of a funny place, but let me just go to this one here if I can. This is for Nancy. Hang on one second. Hang on here. Oh, goodness. Oh, yeah, for either Nancy or Susanne. How much is the problem of malnutrition a knowledge education problem, and how much is an affordability problem requiring better economic opportunities? Maybe Nancy, you can address that first.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for the question. I think that it's not often that you would say it's one or the other. Oftentimes, they're a combination of factors that are influencing malnutrition. And I don't know of any assessment that's tried to quantify attribution of any factor across the system, other than conducting situation analysis for very specific contexts to try to focus interventions. And the results of those types of analyses are going to be only valid for that very specific context. And so I don't think that there is a universal answer to that question, except to say that oftentimes it's never one or the other, that there are different degrees by which you may place importance on any particular drivers. And Whenever possible, it's always advisable to do a situation analysis for your context, even if it's a rapid analysis, just to get a feeling for what could be the most impactful mechanism to address the malnutrition problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Luka, I've got a question for you. Here it is. You postulate that it is important to get it right in addressing acute malnutrition through investing in the system of government. Which are the key investment areas within government systems that are likely to yield better nutrition outcomes?
Yeah, thank you very much, Greg, and for Lumoro for such a question. I think you are right in sense the one of the key areas based on my own experience in South Sudan and during the difficult times of protracted crisis is how you can be able to have a government committed to a commitment for food security. And that can only be done by a clear case of developing a national food security strategy. One of the things that it has been shown, and it is very clear, that the food security strategy, it should be linked and anchored to the nation vision and its strategy. And one of the things I found in South Sudan is the fact that a commitment by the government, the entitlement of people for food is a basic right. But it is not only just rhetoric, but you need to look at how you develop such a strategy. It must be people-centered around the human security and in the line of the commitment of the member state for these sustainable development goals. And I think one of the things I found very clear, and it is good that Uri mentioned it very clear, is the whole lot of the early warning system. And I think that system, sometimes we have a very alien system that are not sensitive to the local conditions. I'm one of the people, I use the traditional method in how best we can gather the information with the people about their livelihood and their vulnerability. And those systems are very important. That's why it's something that should recognize the wealth of information and the wealth of the local institutions in responding to the food security in the area. And I think as the local in this strategy, it is very important to start first what people have in terms of system and institutions. Those institutions are the front line and they should be recognized. It's not only in terms of assessing the vulnerability and insecurity, but in terms of response. Because sometimes you have a system whereby you have an alien external intervention that undermines the local system. So a strategy that is actually recognizing the traditional institutions and system at that local level, because these are the real people who are actually in the front line and can be able to deliver a good food security outcomes. Let me stop here.
Good, thank you, Luka. Orre, I've got a question for you here. Here it is. How are we linking early warning and early action communications or messages to the nomadic communities in dryland areas, to climate-related shocks? And which mechanism are you recommending to use to deliver? Any examples in the Horn of Africa from your experience?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It's not an easy question because, as you know, the pastoral communities all over the world have also their own internal early warning mechanisms. But some of the issues that we have done, we give them weather climate forecast information. And in terms of drought preparedness, we also know that depending on the drought stage, the likely, based on the past experience, the likely measures or challenges that could arise. For example, we know that at a given drought stage, there's a possibility of livestock and people moving to one place to another. That will be associated with conflict. And once we model that, we get that information in terms of movement and the likely possible next movement stage, we alert the security agents and also the communities. And we also activate our contingency plans the peace security activity, peace security plans. The other aspect, and which is very important, is because in our drought classification, the third stage is normally the alarm stage. At that particular stage, there's a possibility of markets being affected. Sometimes they collapse if if it goes beyond the that level of the alert of the alarm. We advise them to market through the local vernacular radio vernacular stations, advising them to destock in advance when the prices are still good. At a later stage, we also communicate if it goes beyond a level where there's market interventions on where they can find their markets, better livestock market prices, and if government is to intervene, when and where. It's not a very easy question. It's one of the areas that we are working on at the moment in terms of feedback to pastoralists and how to influence them to make certain decisions.
Good.
Yeah, but of course, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Orre. I've got another question for you, Nancy. Here it is. You mentioned that you use system analysis. What do you specifically use? Do you model the food system elements and mathematically simulate the outcomes of different interventions?
Thanks for that question, Greg. It's actually a really timely question because one thing that we've recognized in the COVID-19 response and attempts to mitigate negative impacts of the pandemic response on food security, nutrition, and food systems is that there are actually quite a lot of tools out there in terms of doing analyses across the food system. They range from very quick, rapid analyses that focus on very specific outcomes of the food systems to much more complex and comprehensive analyses or assessments. And what we as FAO are doing currently is trying to pull together those various assessment methods and develop a tool that's easier for uptake, something that is more modular, that could help support in any given context, any given country needs, a provision of a nutrition module, livelihood module, and rapid assessment, more of, if you've got more time, more resources, a longer assessment. There's actually something that we're putting a good deal of time and thought into currently, because the generation of more evidence around what the impacts, the empirical evidence around the impacts of food system approaches will help us in our continued conversation to reinforce the need to take one of these systems approaches. There was another question I saw in the Q&A that asked about how do we mobilize resources for systems approaches? And one thing that we think is important is generating the evidence that they're effective. So thank you very much for the question. I hope that answers.
Great, thank you, Nancy, for that. Let me see if I can switch over to another series of questions here. Hang on one second. Susanne, can you say a bit more about assessing institutions or how to do a political economy analysis of food and nutrition?
Thank you, Greg. Well, I can try. I think, I mean, obviously there's different ways of doing this. So I can talk about how I've been kind of doing this myself. I mean, I think part of the issue is that the range of systems and institutions is so broad. So it's really important to determine what is, even in terms of nutrition, what is important for a particular kind of population group or a particular, livelihood system even. And then it's kind of, as I said, I mean, it's looking at beyond as well as kind of within communities. And I mean, from the institutional side, looking at kind of role, function, how it's, things that Luka was talking about, issues of transparency, of accountability. But I think when we talk about political economy, it's really looking at how kind of the power relations function within kind of, well, here we're talking about kind of social, political, economic institutions. And I think one of the things that I've done, and I think that others have also talked about, is to really look at kind of the actors, the practices associated with that. And, whether that's, I mean, look at, how, say, I mean, we talked about kind of markets or private institutions. I mean, how are they actually functioning? And even look at, what's the role? I mean, the things that I talked about, the role of patronage networks, how do different interests concentrate around production, around trade, and around aid. Actually, one of the questions I've been kind of struggling with that was in the Q&A box was about the role of private institutions. And I've always kind of, well, not always, I mean, in much of my work, because of the kind of the concentration of power within, say, a very small group of traders or kind of commercial farmers, I mean, the private sector has often been part of the problem. But I think, so one of the things you need to do there is think about it at different levels. I mean, a trader in Mogadishu or in Khartoum is very different from a trader in Darfur or in Baidoa. So, I mean, to think about at these different levels is very helpful. And the lower down you get, the more kind of, I guess, social obligations or kind of culture, I mean, the more the local institutions that Luka has talked about come into play. But this is a very difficult question, I think. I mean, in Somalia also, I've been thinking about it, the really kind of massive companies. Is there a way that you can, I mean, that they can, in the absence of a stable government, that they can contribute to different ways of providing aid? Yeah, anyway, it's a tricky one. I'm sorry, that's not a very a good answer. Thank you.
Thanks for grappling with it, Susanne. We've got about a minute left before I turn this back to Mary. So Luka, can I turn to you just for maybe if you can add on to what Susanne was talking about, particularly around the political issues that we face when we're trying to do good nutrition?
Yeah, I think just to build what Susan said, I think I want just to highlight one point is when we talk about the institution, we need to link it to the issue of social contract between the citizen and the state, because it is around those relationships, the relationship between the citizen and the state, and the relationship of the citizens among themselves. And that's one of the things the vulnerability we are seeing on the continent is about this social contract is still work in progress. And I think it is very important that the consciousness of the demand of people for good governance becoming a key and very important. And I think that the whole lot of assessing this institution, always I feel it is extremely, extremely important. Let us start what people have at the local level, what people don't come with something that is so alien, something that cannot be implemented. Assess those institutions in terms of the how they function, how do they deliver, how could they ensure the issue of accountability and transparency, and what are the commitments at the local level for how to support the vulnerable people. The case of South Sudan is a good example. In South Sudan, even if I take Dinka, for example, the properties or the cows are actually, they have a feeling it's entrusted to the owner. But you have the right during the crisis that you can actually have access to that one. To the level you can spear to the cow if you are very vulnerable and you have the right even to go to the traditional courts, to the chief, claiming assistance from the relatives or from the community. So I think it is very important to assess those informal institutions at the local level beside the formal institutions in terms of the key components of good governance that are actually existing at the local level. Let me stop with Greg. Yeah.
Thank you, Luka. So for everybody, we have many more questions than we can get to. Many of them are related to livelihoods and resilience and vulnerability and shocks, which we will talk about next week. So keep an eye in your email and look for the recordings of this one. And so what I'd like to do then is go to Mary now to give us some of her final thoughts. Mary?
Thank you, Greg. We've been looking today at systems and institutions in order to better understand how they can potentially buffer shocks and sustainably address acute malnutrition. So what are my key takeaways? Firstly, that systems and institutions support livelihoods, strengthen food security, contribute to the delivery of healthy diets, and underpin health, public health and health services. In dryland areas, formal and informal institutions reflect how the unpredictability typical of drylands is managed. Frequent shocks may lead to high rates of wasting, but only if the prevailing systems and institutions from the family upwards are enabled to mediate their impact. Systems and institutions determine power relations and thus resource distribution across society, which in turn influences vulnerability to disaster, the resilience of livelihoods, diets, and nutrition. Sustainable solutions to addressing malnutrition involve strengthening all of the systems and institutions that make a contribution to nutrition outcomes. Finally, to address malnutrition, we need to use a systems-based approach to understand better how different parts of the system interact, so that we can begin to identify ways to improve the operation of the system as a whole. Thank you all for your participation today. This concludes our webinar. I encourage you to join next week's webinar, where we will look at dryland livelihood systems, vulnerability, resilience, and shocks. Thank you and goodbye.